Hey everyone, it's patch 9.1 in last Epoch, and we're back with another build guide. So today we're going to be bringing something pretty interesting. If you've watched my Fred guide on a solo Archmage Skeleton Mage setup, this will be very reminiscent of that. I wanted to come and play a Golem build as in patch 9.1, a new chestplate was released called Aaron's Will, which allows you to have multiple bone golems without needing to actually take the node for bone golem, twin golems, that reduces your golem strength for the upside of having multiple golems. This means we don't have to deal with the negative 45% damage and the negative 25% health. And as you can see, instead of just having one, we have 3 total golems, which makes this chestplate a massive DPS multiplier. And typically, the way I've seen people play this build is keeping your golems as normal physical golems and going over here and going with bone chatter. But what I'll be showing you today is a new version of golems going DEATHCHILL golems. And this is going to be using a lot of the mechanics that went behind Fred and the ways we scale Fred. This is going to be a low life, but not low life builds and stacker minion builds that likes to focus on a specific minion, but we still have 3 minions. It's quite an interesting build guide, and there's quite a lot of interactions behind how this works. So why don't we get into it and talk a little bit about it? Now, before we go any further, I do want to put this right at the beginning of the video so you're not surprised. You absolutely need Aaron's Will to play this build. Aaron's Will is the rarest chestplate in the game at a 80% reroll chance. So farming for the chestplate itself is going to be pretty difficult to be able to begin. But as soon as you have Aaron's Will, you can immediately play this build. There is one more item that you kind of need. You can kind of play the game without it, but I really don't recommend it. And that is Twisted Heart from the Reign of Dragons boss. It is a pretty common drop rate item at around 20% drop rate. So it's not too bad to farm, and most people probably already have one, maybe multiple. But you are going to absolutely need both items. You can kind of play without Twisted Hearts. You'll just be ridiculously squishy, but you could theoretically farm one out if you want to start to build with just an Aaron's. But this build is basically unplayable without Aaron's. You can, again, since I did see people try to make Fred work without the low life items, you could play this without Aaron's and just play twin golems. But Aaron's is about a 2.5x damage multiplier, meaning if you want to do empowered monoliths with this build, you're not going to realistically be able to, nor are you going to have a very good time on anything that has a decent amount of health unless you have Aaron's Will. With that said, why don't we get into the build and talk about all of the mechanics behind how this works? The whole goal of our build is going to be taking these 3 golems and making them as strong as possible. The way we're going to be doing that is by making them be cold based. And the reason we want to do that is because we are going to be using Lich's Scorn. Now, the only stats that we care about on Lich's Scorn is the stat at the bottom. 1% cold penetrations for minions affected by Dreadshade per intelligence. With this build, we are going to be trying to get close to about 100 intelligence. With min-max gear, you will hit about 100 or so intelligence in your build, which means they have 100% cold penetration. And we can think of every bit of cold penetration as 1% more damage. So currently, my golems are basically doing 71% more damage. Now, what we're going to be doing in Dreadshade is actually something a little bit different. And we will not be pathing to All for One, which makes it give 60% more damage to one minion, but instead we'll be pathing through Vile Ghast and Pernicious Pact to make it to Egoism, while still making Dreadshade an aura, which means if we apply it to one golem, that means all 3 golems within the circle will benefit from the Dreadshade, which means because they're affected by Dreadshade, it means they'll benefit from Lich's Scorn, which allows us to put Lich's Scorn on multiple of our golems, while still benefiting from the big nodes of Dreadshade, which are Egoism and the damage and attack speed from Blind Flurry and Grim Fate. Let's move on to how to level this build, and then we can talk about the setup, the skills, and so much more. I was going to include a leveling guide in this, but it is effectively the same exact leveling guide as in the Fred video. And Max Roll very conveniently has a very nice and thorough leveling guide on exactly what I was going to recommend for you to level as. The TLDR of what you'll be leveling as is a Spirit Plague build until you are able to get enough specialization slots to be playing a Bone Golem Bone Shatter and Rip Blood setup, which will actually be very close to what you'll be playing in Endgame. The leveling build for this will basically get you all the way to the points where you can put on Aaron's Will and start playing the build. Since this build realistically does not start until you get to level 75 for the chestplate, which will be quite a while off. With that said, this build guide on max roll should more than carry enough through leveling, and I will personally vouch for how good this leveling guide is. It is very, very well put together. So this will be linked below, and this should give you more than enough information on how to level this build to 75 without me having to add a 10-minute section to the video talking about leveling. Next, let's move on to the skills behind this build and how we'll be putting it all together. The first thing I want to mention is in the description below, there will be a last Epoch build planner on this whole setup that has some sample items in terms of what stats you're aiming to get on said piece of gear, all the uniques, all the blessings that we actually care about, some sample idols, and as well as all the passive skills and all of the passive points that you need for this. So if you want a build guide for this build, there will be a link in the description below. Let's talk about these skills. So this build is pretty rigid in terms of skills that we want to use. The only realistic skill that we can be flexible on is going to be summon volatile zombies. Otherwise, Dreadshade, Golems, Rip Blood, and Summon Skellies are absolutely required for this build. Let's start with Summon Skellies. So we don't actually care about any of the tree here. As you can see, I've just picked a bunch of random nodes. None of these matter. The only points that we actually care about, and we'll go over to the build plan to make it a little bit easier to see, are going to be all of the +1 skeleton nodes. So we will come up here for Grave Walkers, we'll come over here for Marrow Walkers, and we'll come here for Hollow Walkers. Outside of that, every other point in Summon Skellies is absolutely pointless. The reason we want to pick up those maximum skeletons points is because Aaron's will give us 1 additional Bone Golem per 4 maximum skeletons. So if we pick up all of the +1 skeletons from the tree, will be a +6 skeletons just from the skill itself. Then, because we are a Necromancer, we get +1 skeleton by default. And we're then going to be picking up Tyrant's Legion to get another one, which puts us at 8, which means we get 2 additional skeletons. Now, eventually, we could get 4 more in this build by running double Hollow Finger, putting a +1 maximum skeleton on a 1 LP Aaron's, and picking up the final +1 skeleton on the tree, Unbound Necromancy. But I wish you luck with that. And the problem is that kind of bricks the build because we need a very specific ring for this. Either way, all you're going to be doing with skeletons is just simply picking up all the +1 skeletons. And then to get rid of the notification that you have extra points, you just pick up whatever you'd like on the tree. It really does not matter. I just chose random points to make it pretty. Next up, we have Golem itself. Now, while leveling, you will be playing as Bone Shatter and you'll be picking up all the points over here. Once you are ready to swap over to this build, which I would recommend to wait at least until Lich's Corn at level 63, or if you want to make it extra comfy, wait until Aaron's, but I personally started playing this at 63 and had no problems. We will be swapping over to DEATHCHILL Golems. Now, the way we want to path this to start with is we immediately want to rush over here and pick up DEATHCHILL and pick up Breath of Prosperous. This will give us some decent damage for the AoE because DEATHCHILL Golems will chill on autos, but they also have a extra ability, Freezing Grasp. What this does is a small AoE around them, which does about as much damage as their auto attacks does. So it's a 6-second cooldown AoE auto attack, and it's pretty decent for clearing, and it doesn't really waste too much time in their attack animation, making it decent to pick up this to get a little bit more damage from any vitality scaling you might have. After we pick up all this, we immediately want to come to the right side, pick up Amalgam of Rogues, pick up a Natural Speed, and then immediately pick up 5 points in Hunger. What Hunger is going to do is it's going to make all of our golems give us 65 health on hit per golem. Now, if you choose to play this immediately at level 63, you will need to pick up twin golems until you get Aaron, so you would have to put 4 points in Amalgam. But between twin golems and Hunger, that will be your defensive layer while you are leveling all the way to 75. Once you have those points, I would recommend to pick up Tower of Bones. It's going to make them have threat generation, which means that they will tank for you most of the time. Bone Golems are pretty tanky by default, and they're going to have amazing leech, so they will be able to keep themselves alive. And this makes it so you are a little bit safer while running around. For the last few points, what I'd recommend is to pick up 4 points in Natural Speed. This gives them movement speed, and it buffs other nearby minions, including themselves. So this basically means that they are giving each other a stupid amount of movement speed each, which is pretty important for these golems. You'd also put 5 points into Cold Vengeance to give them 50 base melee cold damage, which is quite a lot of added damage. And then your last few points can just go into Amalgam of Rogues for more movement speed and some attack speed. Moving on to Dreadshade. So the typical Dreadshade pathing for most builds is pathing through All for One, because you're typically only taking Dreadshade if you're playing a single character build. But instead, we'll be going through Vile Ghast, which makes it so it now does poison damage to whatever it is linked to, and Pernicious Pact, which makes it so every single time our Dreadshade is supposed to do damage, instead applies a stack of Everlasting Poison, which is poison that will not fall off the enemy until the minion dies. We're then going to also be picking up Blind Fury. This is going to give us a lot of attack speed. We're going to be picking up 4 points in Spectral Presence to make the AoE of Dreadshade bigger. As we can see with 4 points, it is quite big. And I've noticed it's actually quite important, as your Bone Golems like to go all over the place. So having a really big radius on this allows all 3 of them to always be inside of it. One downside, as you can see, is the Golem is going to be taking poison damage. Now, this is relatively minor, especially since it has so much leech. And because of egoism, because we have 100% crit chance, we can use River of Bones to keep that Golem alive really well. This gives it double leech rates, and it gives it 20% of crit damage as leech, which basically means that they don't really care about this. And worst case, if we do care about it, if we were to summon a new Golems, if we pretended we had 3, when you resummon a new Golem, it will always prioritize the lowest health one. And typically your lowest health one is going to be the one that has a Dreadshade on it. Every time Dreadshade is up, all you have to do is just resummon a Bone Golem and then just immediately Dreadshade it. Now, because our Golem is taking damage from Dreadshade, it might be a little bit annoying to keep them alive, but it shouldn't really be that bad, because it will have 100% crit chance from egoism, which means we can abuse River of Bones to have a massive amount of healing on said minion. River of Bones gives it 20% of damage leached as health, and it doubles the total leech from the minion, meaning 40% of the damage leached is healed back to it. And the nice thing is what we can do is if we resummon a Bone Golem, it will always prioritize unsummoning the lowest health one. And all we have to do is we just need to resummon a Bone Golem about every 20 seconds or so, and just immediately re-Dreadshade it. And then we have no problem with 100% uptime. Next, let's talk about Rip Blood. So Rip Blood is going to be a very, very interesting skill in this build. We will be playing a Twisted Heart build, and this is going to be the only way to actually stay alive in this build. What Twisted Heart does is it will take 14% of our current health and convert it to ward when we directly cast a necrotic spell. With this, and a little bit of ward retention stacking, which we have because we have so much intelligence, we can actually get to pretty high ES amounts. As we can see, if I'm just standing here and spamming Rip Blood, I can realistically get myself to about 4,000 ward with nothing else. Now, this is going to be made a lot better. And because Twisted Heart is based on our current health, that means we want to be near maximum life at all times to be able to turn as much of our health into ward as we can. That is why we are going Rip Blood. So we can make Rip Blood a necrotic skill by coming over here and pick up Rip Spirit. These points do absolutely nothing for us other than turn into a necrotic skill to be able to proc hearts. Then we're going to be coming over to the left side. And the left side is going to give us cast speed. And we also need to pick up Thirst, so we make it free. Otherwise, we have massive mana problems. And then we're going to be picking up Quenching, which makes it so instead of them restoring 10 health, it's 30 health. We're then going to be picking up Marrow Drinkers, so we can only use them on our minions, but it doubles the healing, so they now give 60 health. And then we're going to be picking up Hematology, which makes it so the health restored is increased by 5% per intelligence. So if we had 100 intelligence in a late game build, that means it's 500% stronger, which means Rip Blood on its own basically will out heal Twisted Heart for the most part, and will give us amazing sustain, amazing way to heal, especially since it's 0 mana cost and we could spam it so hard because of the cast speed from Necromancer. We're then going to be pathing towards the bottom to get Splatter, to get more Splatter AoE, and most importantly, to get Blood Infusion. Now, what this does is when we cast it on our minions, or when the Blood and Splatter actually hits our minions, they will gain 15% more damage for 4 seconds, and since we have a point left over, an additional 8% attack speed. Because on bosses, we will most likely just be sitting there spamming Rip Blood like this, we can permanently give them 15% more damage while also giving us a ton of recovery. Last skill to talk about is volatile zombies. Now, the reason we're running these in this build is going to be for Marked for Death. This is going to be a very easy way to apply Marked for Death, which is going to give us quite a lot of damage. The zombies themselves actually hit very, very hard on their own. So they will actually contribute a pretty decent amount of damage to your build. We'll also be looking to get Necromancer Fervor, which will make us heal from these zombies. And eventually in a super, super late game build, especially when this gets fixed, we'll be going Vital Ward. So instead give us a lot of ward instead of life. And we will be picking them up for the amazing kill threshold that they give us. So this will make it so our zombies will kill all bosses, all enemies at 16% or lower health, making these a wonderful utility skill in this game, in this build. Last few points are going to be spent on Fervor to make them a little bit faster and on Leap Attack to just make them a little bit more consistent. This is personally a personal choice, but if you don't like this, you can always get rid of these points. And for example, pick up Grave Attunement, which will make them do even more damage. This will actually make them do quite insane amounts. You pick up a second point in Ravenous to make them do even more damage on bosses. They will actually chunk bosses for maybe 5% of its health every time they proc. And you can choose to instead maybe pick up some more movement speed to make them a little bit faster. Let's talk about the passive tree next. So our passive tree is going to be focused around picking up intelligence, picking up crit chance, and picking up word retention for ourselves. While leveling, we're going to be wanting to put points into Forbidden Knowledge, into Dark Rituals, and into Soul and Vitality to get us to 20 points so we can move on to Necromancer. Once we are able to put points into Necromancer, we want to max out Grave Thorns. It's going to make our minions tanky enough to level with, and then put some points into Risen Army to get them some more attack speed. And what we want to do is we want to rush Cursed Blood and pick up 8 points in Aegis Fall to give us a way to apply Armor Shred, and this is going to be a massive DPS increase. Afterwards, we want to come and pick up Fanatic Summons and then immediately path into River of Bones. We are going to be skipping over Heresy, and this is something you'll be picking up later into the build once you are ready to stack ward retention. And then we're going to be putting 3 points in Moonlight Pyre. At that point, you should be able to pick up 10 points in Rite of Undeath and 10 points in Blade of the Forlorn. Once you have all that, this should put you around level 75. At that point, you can look to put 3 points into Tyrant and 1 point to Tyrant's Legion to get +1 maximum skeletons. And once you have Aaron's Will on, you can backfill some points and finish putting in all of your points into Heresy. And most importantly, as soon as you're level 80 and you can put on Twisted Heart, or as you're approaching level 80 for Twisted Hearts, you're going to want to put 5 points into Reclamation of Souls for word retention. Come back to the Acolyte base tree, put a point into Mania, and 5 points into a Natural Preservation for more word retention. And eventually, with your last 20-ish points or so, as you reach level 100, you'll want to finish up Heresy for Intelligence, which is damage and word retention. And come over to Lich and put your final few points into Apocrythia for some more Intelligence, which again is damage and word retention. As for idols, this build is a pretty resistance-starved build because we're going to be using so many unique items. It's kind of difficult to get the resistances we need. I am not res capped here, but that is because of my own fault. I need to go and get some physical resistance. And I could do that through the Blessing. If we look at the build in the Last Epoch build planner, as we can see, the blessings that we're going to want for this build are going to be the increased leech rate from Black Sun, ward per second from Ending of Storm. This is a massive amount of health. This will give you about on average 500 to 600 ward. The critical strike avoidance from Reign of Dragons. Now this can be replaced with the 20 all-res blessing if you need some resistances while you're putting this build together. It's what I'd recommend. And then eventually to get critical strike avoidance as a late game blessing. And then lastly, we will want the physical resistance blessing from Age of Winter. This is going to be how we fix our physical resistance in this build, and the increased minion damage from Spirits of Fire. Adding in resistance blessings and then fitting in a bunch, adding in resistance blessing and then fitting in a bunch of resistance idols is going to be how we get to the majority of our resistances. Now, in our passive tree, we do get quite a lot of necrotic resistance and a little bit of poison resistance. So we can actually fully necrotic cap just from a passive tree. We do not need to get a single bit of necrotic resistance anywhere in this build. So all of our idols are going to be focused on getting as much lightning, as much cold, as much fire resistance as we can get, as that is going to be how we get those resistances capped. Our physical resistance is going to come from the blessing primarily, and now getting a max rolled one might be a little bit hard, so you might need a small physical resistance roll somewhere. Then the rest of our gear is going to be focused on poison and void. Our void resistance is going to be fixed by getting a pair of Crusader gauntlets since they have a void resistance implicit on it. And then our poison resistance is going to be fixed by trying to fit poison resistance wherever we can on any of our items. So try to get as many resistance idols as you can in this build. And then for the final slots, we want to fit in 2 minion cooldown recovery speed idols. Now you can get this as a 3 tall one or a 4 tall one. The 4 tall one will have a better roll on it, which can go up to 35%, while the 3 tall one can only go to 23%. But I would recommend to min-max by finding 3 tall ones, as 3 tall ones can roll percent life as a prefix, while the 4 tall ones have absolutely 0 useful prefixes on them. It's okay to use one early game to get a little bit more CDR, as 2 of these actually make quite a big difference. Our golems have a slam attack and like a ground pound attack, and that ground pound attack is going to be the majority of your single target damage, and it is affected by minion cooldown recovery, which is why we want to try and get 2 minion CDR rolls. We don't want to go overboard on CDR, as we do need our idols to fix our resistances, but if you're able to fix your resistances other ways, then fitting in as many cooldown recovery large idols as you can would be a large DPS increase in this build. Let's talk about the gear that you'd want in this build. So as you can see, this build is pretty unique heavy. The main thing that this build is going to be centered around is Aaron's Will, Lich's Scorn, and Twisted Heart. Now, these are basically mandatory, as I mentioned. And then there are a few other really powerful items that we can fit into this build to make it even stronger. Now, Ribbons of Blood might look like a bad ring at first, but Ribbons of Blood is a absolutely insane and basically mandatory ring in this build. What it does is it gives us a portion of our minions melee damage as life leech on hit, which means that our minions will pretty much keep us alive on their own. Between Rip Blood healing us, as well as proccing Twisted Heart, and the leech from the minions, we can basically sit at full health permanently without us having to do absolutely anything at all. That means we can always remove as much of our current health as possible for Twisted Hearts, which will give us a massive ward pool while running around. This ring, I would say, is basically unreplaceable, and I don't think you can realistically ever get rid of this, especially since this also gives you minion leech rate, which makes your minions live a little bit better. When combined with the increased leech rate roll on a pair of gloves, we can get some insane healing. And whenever I'm just running around doing monoliths, my golems in about 2 hits will instantaneously heal me to full. This by itself will make your early game progression really easy. And once you're ready to swap over to Twisted Hearts, will be the engine that drives your ability to spam Rip Blood and get yourself to very high word counts. Now, this builds with my current unoptimized setup. I, again, only have 71 int. I'm only level 83. I can realistically get to about 7k ward or so in this build with no problem. On top of having 2000 life, which is basically always full, I am effectively sitting at about 9000 total health. And if my ward does fully deplete, my leech rate is so quick that I basically am always at 2000 life, meaning I need to be one shot for my final 2000 health pool. To make our ward a little bit more consistent, we are also pairing in a chronostasis. This gives us ward per second, and at 80 ward per second on a max roll is going to give us a stupid amount of extra ward. This is equivalent to about 500 to 800, depending on your ward retention, consistent ward. As you can see, I'm sitting at about 3k ward or so just standing here. This paired with a Last Steps of the Living gives us quite good recovery on our ward when we are not rip blooding, which means between Last Steps of the Living, chronostasis, and Ribbons of Blood healing us, we are sitting at a comfortable 4,500 to 5,000 total life pool that has ridiculously good recovery while running around in monoliths. And on bosses or points where we have to stand still, we can spam Rip Blood to boost our total life pool up to 9k and above. And I can easily see this going to 11 and 12k with better gear. That is why we are fitting this in. If you saw this and you'd be like, Allie, if you're trying to stay a full life for Twisted Hearts, what is the point of Last Steps of the Living? Well, there you have it. The point is to make it comfortable while you're mapping so you don't have to stop. And it means you can run around faster and be able to do your maps faster without you having to consistently spam Rip Blood and consistently replenish your ward pool like a typical Twisted Heart build would have to stay alive while mapping. Moving on to the next few pieces of gear. we are going to be fitting in a Death Rattle. Now, Death Rattle is just way too good for this build not to use. Just like Chronostasis, it has a little bit of intelligence on it, meaning it's making Lich's scoring better. The Implicit is also just really good for this build. Minion critical strike chance, as we do have 2 minions we need to give crit chance to, and Minion critical strike multiplier from the actual item itself, giving us a very large amount of extra damage on them. The only downside is it does make our minions take more damage, but because they have so much leech, this basically does not matter at all. For our helmets, we are looking to get a plus summon Bone Golem helmets. Now, I managed to get a +3, but if you just have Bone Golem Shards, a tier 5 roll will be +2. And you're trying to get intelligence on here and any sort of resistances and any sort of crit avoidance that you can get. You do need 1 crit avoidance somewhere because you will not be fully crit avoidance capped on its own. We will be going for the crit avoidance blessing, but this is only 70%. So we will need to get the last 30% somewhere, which can either be a crit avoidance roll on a helmet or a crit avoidance roll on a belt. Try to get a burial mask if you can, as it is a ward retention base and it would be very good for this build. But we're mostly just looking to get Bone Golem on the helmet. For a belt, this is going to be our filler slots. This is where you're going to be putting any sort of extra stats on that you might need. So for example, you can put any resistance that you need on here. You can put crit avoidance on here. And if you have your suffixes filled with the stats you like, you can just put minion damage and minion health on here. We do want a little bit of minion health to make our Bone Golems a little bit tankier. If we don't do this, they'll be kind of squishy in tier 4 dungeons, and they'll be kind of squishy once we're pushing 400 or 500 corruptions. But for everything else, you shouldn't really need it, but it's a nice to have stat and it'll make it a lot more comfy. This basically lets them AFK in every single boss mechanic in lower tier content. For our second ring, we just want a ring with intelligence. And again, any stats that you might need. So you can fit in here minion damage, you can fit in resistances, you can fit in life, you can try and get avoidance roll on here as well. Just use your belt and your ring as filler slots for whatever stats you're missing. And then for gloves, on gloves, the only stats we realistically need are going to be intelligence and increased leech rate. The increased leech rate will apply to the leech they get from Rivens of Blood, making it a very, very powerful tool to stay alive pre-Aaron's. And in just a endgame setup with Twisted Heart allows you to sit at max life a little bit easier. Try to get intelligence on here as well, and then just fit whatever else you can. I have a pair of void resistance gloves. This is how I'm fully maxing out my void resistance. And I end up putting some minion health on it just to make them a little bit better. I did Glyph of Despair the increased AoE that was on it before, which I guess is kind of nice because it does make the volatile zombie a little bit bigger and the rip blood a little bit bigger, but it's kind of a useless stat. In terms of the priority on how you would go about farming for this build, assuming you have Aaron's Will, is farming Twisted Heart immediately if you don't have one, and farming Lich's Scorn. It's up to you which one you'd want to go for first, because Twisted Heart is kind of needed to stay alive. But if you have a Ribbons of Blood, you should be okay. You'll just have a very small health pool. And then as soon as you get Lich's Scorn, you can go Cold Golems, and this will literally quadruple your damage, if not more. It is a very, very broken offhand. After that, I'd probably go for a Death Rattle, since it will give you so much damage, and it's very easy to. It's one of the most common amulets in the game. Or a Chronostasis, because this is again one of the most common items in the game, and it will give you quite a lot of extra damage and quite a lot of survivability. You should most likely get a Last Steps of the Living while you are farming for Lich's Scorn, so I won't really say that you need to do that. But if you somehow don't get a Last Step, because both of these items come from the same boss, then go finish and get yourself a Last Steps of the Living before moving on. Lastly, from there, you just want to farm a Bone Golem helmet if you need one. And if you for some reason need Bone Golem Shards and you don't have enough, the best way to do it if you have a stupid amount of money is to actually come to the gambler and just continuously keep buying Acolyte helmets with the hopes that they roll Bone Golem on. This is something I did for Fred to get increased Skeleton Mage shards, and I believe it costed me around 1,000,000 gold or so to get 5 this way. What you would do is if you do actually get plus Bone Golem on one of the helmets that you buy from the gambler, you would take it, you would put it in here, and you would not shatter. You would instead Rune of Removal to attempt to hit the Bone Golem, because if you do, you're guaranteed shards. Versus if you shatter, there's actually a chance that you don't get shards for the Bone Golem, which might make it a little bit harder to get what you want. Another option as well, if you have a lot of Runes of Discovery, which are kind of useless for everything else, is you could just take every single helmet the gambler gives you and Rune of Discovery them. This will put random things on here and actually has a pretty good chance of hitting Bone Golem. From this point, you can either Rune of Removal or Rune of Shatter if you're out of 4-2 potential. And if you do this, this will make it a little bit easier, but it will be pretty rune intensive to get Bone Golems. But it's realistically the only stat that you're going to need to do this for, as plus Bone Golem Shards are a little bit rare. The last thing I want to talk about before we talk about Endgame are some really helpful tips on how to play this build in a more comfortable way. Now, the first thing I would recommend is to go over to your settings, go to your input keys, and find the Minion movement key, which is right here, Minion attack command. You probably don't have this bound, or it's bound to a weird key. I have mine on spacebar. What this key does is it allows you to control your minions directly. So if I have a golem, if I want it to go over here, or if it's fighting something over here and I want it to be over here with me, what I can do is I can hit my key. And as you can see, I can basically control my golem around as much as I want. Now, it's a little bit finicky, and sometimes they might not listen and sometimes they might keep running, but it's a keybind that you should really know about and add to your arsenal, especially if you're playing a minion build, as this makes them feel a lot better to play. The other thing to mention is in these settings as well is abusing numlock to automate volatile zombies for you so you don't have to manually press them. The way you would do this is you would take whatever key your volatile zombies is on. So for example, for me, it's on ability 5, and set this to a keypad key. Now, you do need a keypad on your keyboard to do this. If you don't have one, you can't do this. So for example, I set mine to keypad 9. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to turn on numlock. While numlock is active, I'm going to press key 9. I'm going to keep holding it and then click numlock again to turn it off. What this will do is I'm not holding anything right now, but as you can see, I am summoning volatile zombies on cooldown. As you can see, the key is pressed. This is a way to effectively permanently keep a key pressed down. And because zombies are something we want to use on cooldown, I can just do this and not have to ever care about summoning zombies, and they will be summoned on cooldown for me perfectly, even as I'm running around. You can also do this for basically any other skill that you'd want to have permanent uptime in any other build. But do keep in mind, you can't do it, for example, with something like Rip Blood, because, well, if I do it with Rip Blood, then I can't play the game. As you can see, I'll be sitting here just spamming Rip Blood every time I'm trying to move, which makes it pretty unplayable. So you kind of have to do it with either abilities like this, which are on a cooldown, or abilities that are instant and don't actually hinder your gameplay. Last thing I want to talk about in this build is about this build and endgame. So how good is an endgame? Well, I would say it is actually quite amazing. As I mentioned, I've made quite a lot of references to my other minion build, Fred. This build actually ends up doing more damage than Fred. Currently, I would say I'm pretty unoptimized in this build. I still have 20 more levels to get. I can get better gear and get more intelligence on all my slots. And with how much gear I already have compared to Fred, which at this point is pretty optimized, I actually do more DPS with my current setup in this build than Fred does. Fred does about 100k-ish per hit on dummies, which means he does maybe around 200k total DPS. My golem build is currently doing maybe around 250 to 300, which makes it do as much damage as a optimized Fred, if not slightly more, with unoptimized gear. Because of this, it's actually a pretty good build. And because you have 3 minions and because the golems are actually really fast, this makes this a really good monolith farmer. Now, if you want to do dungeons and if you want to do tier 4 Julia, for example, you could do it as Julia. You could do it as this build. It's just the only problem with it is it's a minion build. And if you want to do Julia, I would really recommend to play like Flame Wrath, for example, as a minion build. The only issue with this is Julia's beams really hurts, which makes it really difficult to keep these minions alive during the fight. And because of that, you'll have a lot of annoyances having to consistently resummon your golems. Or if you try to actually keep them alive, you'll have to spam your minion movement key and you'll have to position yourself correctly and your minions. It's a lot of effort for not much gain, really, because you're not going to be killing the boss in like 20 seconds, for example. Golems are going to be a little bit slow and probably do like a 1-minute Julia kill. It is not a bosser. They don't have insane single target damage, but they can do the content. And because of that, I wouldn't really recommend doing dungeons as this. But for monoliths, and especially for arena, this is an insane build. For arena, because I can just stand there while the golems do everything and just spam rip blood, I can keep myself at a permanent 9 to 10k health pool, which means I am a very, very tanky throughout the whole arena, meaning I can push very, very high waves. As well as for mapping, because the golems are just so fast, and because there's 3 of them and they tend to spread out a tiny little bit, their clear is really good. And they have like this trample damage that they do, meaning I could just keep moving them forward. And if all 3 are stacked together, they will actually just straight up kill elites and rare enemies while just simply walking over them, making this a pretty decent mapper. I wouldn't say it's really fast. Obviously, bow builds and rogue builds in general are going to be a lot faster. But for a minion build, it's actually quite a zoomer, and it's actually quite refreshing to be able to clear maps so fast. And then for a single target damage, well, their ground pound does so much damage that you basically one-shot most bosses. I would say with this build, you could probably push around 400 to 500 corruption with no problem, but pushing any further than that might be very difficult. This is mostly going to come from your golems not really being able to live, and us not having many sources of increased minion health, which would make it pretty hard for them to actually stay alive in that. In 100 to 300 corruption or so, you shouldn't have any problem. They should be more than tanky enough, but pushing past 300 is going to be a little bit rough, and I don't think you're going to get past 500 or so. Personally, you should be pretty tanky. You should have a decent time living in corruption that high, but this is not a build that's going to push to 1k corruption or to, hundreds and hundreds of corruptions. You'll probably be sticking around 3-ish, 400-ish as your absolute max, and just using it as a comfortable farmer around that point. This build is not meant to be some super OP meta build, but it's meant to be something comfortable that you can farm content with and just lay back and relax for the most part with, minimal input from your part. And it's just meant to be a Fred 2.0 that does a lot more damage. That's all I have for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have. You are also free to come by my Twitch and ask me there. I stream basically every day, and I'll be more than happy to help you with your build or answer any questions you might have. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.